Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Sero Boost, the Happiness Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We're champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Lu Ngo, coming to your ears from Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. Let's learn together. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Sero Boost. And on this week's episode, we are going to talk about social interdependence and romantic relationships. I don't know about you, but I'm certain this topic is going to help with our understanding of our happiness. And our guest today is very lovely, joining us in her evening. Welcome to our show, Julie. I would love to introduce Julie to everyone and also get her to share a bit more about herself before we start the conversation. Julie Nguyen is a certified relationship coach, matchmaker, and mental health writer. She's passionate about working with growth-oriented people and innovative relationship brands looking to ask interesting questions about themselves and love. Her writing explores themes around mental well-being, culture, psychology, trauma, and human intimacy. Thank you so much for joining us today, Julie.
Thank you so much, Lou. I'm so happy to be here. I'm honored to share space with you in this moment.
Yeah. So I ask all my guests this question because I'm really curious about everyone's journey. I'm sure it's not random that you ended up here doing the work that you're doing. So why did you choose this work and how did you get here in your career?
Well, I've always been really fascinated about the exploration of love. I was always that kid in middle school asking all of my friends like, who they had crushes on, the dynamics between their friendships, and what really made me want to step into this my career was when I was in my 20s. I started doing digital marketing and I really did not like that startup life culture. And I just answered this random job ad to be a matchmaker. And that was always something that I was so compelled by. I thought it was a made up job. I didn't think that it was something I could actually have a sustainable career in. And it ended up being this 10-year career of me learning what it's like to thoughtfully match people together, help people with one of the most important searches of finding love, and coaching them through the process of facilitating these introductions. Mm-hmm. So it was, like something that's always I've always been curious about it as a child, and then I happened to stumble into it as my career, and I'm just very happy that I kind of chose to answer that random ad.
Yeah, that is very interesting. I don't think I've heard of a job ad that says matchmaker. I'm fascinated by that. Definitely, if our audience are listening and they're kind of like, I want to do something like that, they can actually search for the keyword matchmaker. That sounds so fun. Definitely not a traditional career because, who would go and search for a job called matchmaker, So that's really interesting. That's fun. I think I checked out your blog when, I was preparing for the conversation, and you see a few different interesting topics there that you touched on. And I'm sure today we'll probably cover some of them. Before we get into that conversation about social interdependence and romantic relationships, let's talk a bit more about you so our audience get to know you better. We have a section called Have You Met Julie, where we get to know our guests better and help our audience to understand the guests better through some of the things they love. My first question to you is, what is your favorite book?
My favorite book right now, it tends to change with my mood, but there's two that I'm reading that I really, really love. The first one is The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle. And that's a book I'm constantly revisiting because it's so dense, it's so informative, and it's so rich, so many insights. So I'm reading that right now, and I really love the journey. And I'm also reading this new book that I've been recommending a lot to my friends, and it's called Hunt, Gather, Parent, which is this really fascinating book about how to parent based on ancient cultures and indigenous tribes and how they do it versus more like westernized parenting modalities. So it It's really cool. It kind of like switches around a lot of the ways that I view how we raise like, family, community, and children in ways that are more like community centered oriented.
Yeah, that's definitely something different. The first book, The Power of Now, I've read, but the second one I have not read yet. So, that's a really good recommendation. Thank you for sharing. How about a movie that you like, or maybe something that you've enjoyed recently?
A movie that I've enjoyed recently is this movie Coherence. It's relatively unknown, but it's an indie time travel multiverse movie. I saw that. I live in SoCal, and there was like this flooding that happened last weekend. So I spent the entire weekend indoors just watching movies. And I've loved that movie for a long time, but whenever I watch it again, it's always so confounding and so fascinating to kind of watch all of these characters mixed together. I really highly recommend it if you want to watch something that's a little bit more of a mind trip.
That is so interesting. I've never heard of that movie before. So yeah, you're right in saying that it's not that popular, but
yeah, that's it's on Amazon Prime. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Oh, okay, cool. I do have Prime, so I'll check that out for sure. Cool. How about a podcast, if you are a podcast listener?
I tend to be a podcast listener. A podcast that I really love, it's one called Experable by Krati Mehra. She's an empowerment coach based in India, and she just has a really amazing guest roundup and a super strong, passionate take on mental health. And I admit I'm just really biased because she's one of my really good friends, but I just really love the way that she like talks about all of these different perspectives and relationships and health. And she has a really strong, dedicated perspective to it. So I love listening to her stuff.
Yeah, well, that's wonderful. And, great that you gave your friend a shout out as well, on another podcast. So that's great. So I'm not sure if you've got one role model, or maybe multiple role models, or maybe you actually don't have role models.
I think I do. I for sure do, because when I think about role models, and maybe it's because I'm really thinking about family a lot. And I think that's kind of my current fascination of research. Yeah. I believe that parents are like a really amazing role model. I really love how fathers and mothers show up for their family and communities. I think there's something so beautiful and healing about seeing that sort of love demonstrated in that dynamic and context. Yeah. So those are people I tend to look up to. And I have been really in so admiration to a lot of my friends who are just showing up for their families in that way. And I feel like it's so difficult. And I watch them, do the day in work. So full admiration for them.
Yeah, definitely. And finally, in this part, I think you mentioned learning new things and doing research in one of the previous answers. So I wonder which course you've taken so far in your life that has been the most influential to you.
I have done sexuality, relationship, the Enneagram, which is this personality modeling typing system. I feel like the most significant for me is going to be, I'm clearing up a lot of space right now so I could do a death doulaship certificate. And that's going to be happening sometime this summer. But I am just waiting to feel like I'm in a mental space where I can kind of welcome that energy into my life. But that's my next step right now.
Oh, okay. That's definitely something different for sure.
It's very different. Yeah.
Yeah. I did not expect that. So thank you for sharing that. That might really be influential. So, I think that's going to be something else for sure. And thank you for sharing the things that you enjoy and the things that you are going to do and some plans with us. That's really fun to hear. Now let's talk about social interdependence and romantic relationships in the context of happiness, because, that's what we're here to talk about. So first of all, before we start talking about romantic relationships and other aspects of it, I would love to understand your personal perspective on happiness.
I love that. It's such a loaded question because it's so universally different for everybody. It's like a really big thinker. Yeah. But I would say that happiness is living your life on your own terms, not by anyone else's, by your partner, by your mom, by your teacher, your friend. It's really about what you want and being completely unflinchingly authentic about that pursuit. And to guide that into a higher plane, I think it's really important to couple that with being truly kind, understanding, and compassionate. So you're not this blunt instrument hurting people on this path of happiness. but you're really kind of centered within community, which I think is so related to social interdependence. I believe that happiness is really about finding your own meaning of life, whether that's like tending to your garden or your animals or your family or crypto, whatever it is. It just has to be fulfilling and true for you.
Yeah.
And my personal version of happiness is really, I mean, I think my entire career and journey has been about the expression and radiation of love in all of its forms. I think about it from a platonic sense, familial, community, romantic. I personally, like one of my goals is I really want to have a sustainable farm one day. I want to rescue animals. I want to have it with my partner and our family and our friends. So yeah, that's many different interpretations of happiness, but that's kind of how I view it.
Yeah, well, beautiful. I love that definition. And I really agree that, it's a unique perspective for each person. And no matter how many times I hear these definitions, I still pick up something new. And I think for today, being able to live on your own terms is actually quite tough. And I think that is something that, a lot of young people are talking about nowadays. And, in this Western society that I'm, sort of living in now, I feel like it's quite different from, the Asian background that I was from. And I'm kind of like, oh, like this is so different. Like, how do I navigate this? Like, I can actually do what I want. Now it feels a bit scary, but also exciting. Like, what do I do with it? Like I can do another degree. Like I can actually study what I wanted to study. I couldn't do it. And, like all these different things. I can travel. I can do whatever I want. And it's just really interesting, especially because, for our audience, when we're recording this episode, it's Lunar New Year. And, like this is going to sound really funny, but I purposely dodged this occasion this year because I don't want to have conversations about, what people want to hear. So I chose to visit my family a little bit earlier, not during Lunar New Year, because I just dread the conversations around the dinner table so much.
It's so loaded. It's so loaded.
Yeah, it is. Like, I'm sure you would understand this. Like, it's just too much. I totally
get it.
Yeah, it's too much to handle. And then it was funny the other day when I was calling my family for Lunar New Year. I was like, oh, how's everyone? Oh, I missed the food. And then everyone's like, yeah, but you're not here. You chose to not be here, remember? And I was like, I know. I'm just saying I miss it. Not that, I miss everything else that's related to it. So I think that's quite important. And also that aspect of social interdependence we're going to talk about today is actually quite a big deal as well when it comes to, living life on your own terms. And it's not just in romantic relationships. I think it manifests in different areas of life, especially if anyone is from an Asian background or from a conservative background, they probably would relate with this. And I think that's why it's not a universal thing, but I'm sure from the work that you do and from the research that you've done, you probably notice that people tend to get a few things wrong when it comes to happiness. Now, again, this is probably going to be quite, it's not subjective enough. Like it's going to be like, I don't know, like it's just going to be strange to describe it from each person's perspective. But I still think there are still some universal things that we can potentially share, So what do you think to be some of the biggest misconceptions people have about happiness?
Well, first, thank you for sharing your Lunar and New Year story. I totally relate. It's like, I get it. You still want to be there at the dinner table. You kind of want to do your own thing. So when you're saying it, I love that you kind of just did what was best for you. Yeah. And you're right that when you're thinking about happiness, it's so nuanced. And I remember stepping into this conversation, it's so philosophical almost, and it's so dependent on how we view it.
Yeah.
But I believe that something that some people can maybe get wrong about happiness is that they believe it's only about the good in life. There's no embrace of the bad. It's only about having positive, euphoric, dopamine hit experiences where it's like the joy, the pleasure, the contentment, the peace.
Yeah.
And that's such a big part of it. But there's this yin yang to it where there has to be this balance needed to really appreciate the good. And that comes from giving as much weight and respect to the duality of the bad. And I believe that these negative emotions of anger and sadness and resentment, these emotions unpack and navigate so much, just like how anger expresses a boundary. When there's something that's been crossed, you feel it in your body. And instead of suppressing that, if you can just be like, oh, I don't like it when somebody does this, and I can just tell the person, it prevents that from happening to you again and you feeling that sense of violation. So I believe when there's just such a focus on the good, we're really denying ourselves the opportunity to live a true life.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's actually quite tough for some people to understand this, especially if they have been living, I would quote unquote call it in bracket a good life, like, with this air quote that I'm doing right now, in case anyone is listening, just the audio version of this, because I think if you're quite, you're from a background where you're just quite I would probably, I don't want to say pampered, because that might not be fair. Like, just some people think that they are not that pampered, but I'm going to use that word because I know a few of my friends who are like that. And I think to them, it's just hard to perhaps, have that compassion when it comes to emotions that are tough, like what you were saying. And then it will be harder for them to appreciate good things in life. Like, they have something really good happening right in front of them and they just cannot appreciate it. And I so relate to what you were saying earlier, because I remember something happened this morning. It was really interesting because I was at the gym and then a song was playing. They play songs all the time, right? They play music. A song came up. And when that song came up, I remembered listening to it same time last year, probably like about a year ago. When I heard that song last year, I felt like all these intense emotions, and it was kind of like, it's a happy song, but I was not feeling happy. I was not feeling okay. And whenever I wanted to have like a little bit of a boost, I would listen to that song. And I can remember struggling with my emotions and trying to get past what I was going through. And then this morning when I listened to the song, I was just like, oh, it's just a happy song. And then I related to that emotion. I was like, oh, I appreciate so much more now. And, it was really hard for me to be able to listen to happy songs. And now I can listen to happy songs without like having to work through my emotions. And I was just so grateful for that little thing. And that is because I didn't have just all the good things, right? And I appreciate little things even more. And so even though I was really tired this morning, I didn't sleep really well last night, I was like, oh, that's such a nice thing to think about. I know it sounds silly and it's like a little thing, but some people might be able to relate with that, because I know a lot of my friends have gone through things like that. And it's just nice to notice things that you can appreciate sometimes.
Totally. It's called, I think about how one of my therapist friends was saying that it's called a glimmer. It's just something shiny that you look forward to in your life. But that's kind of discovered when you've been through some muck,
Yeah.
When there's been a little bit of hardship, or you heard that song during a very hard point of your life and you're like, wow, I'm in the gym, I'm working out. It's so much different than how it was. Those moments are totally worth living for. I love that experience for you.
Yeah, definitely. It was like such a little thing this morning where I was like, very interesting. Like, I feel like so much better. I mean, the class was so hard, but I was focusing on that and it was fine. But anyway, we digress. So coming back to the topic today, we're talking about social interdependence. And I think I'm guessing that a lot of people in our audience might be tuning into this because it's kind of related to romantic relationships. They might not actually know what social interdependence means. So let's help our audience understand it a bit better by defining it. How would you define the topic of social interdependence in the context of our happiness?
Okay. Social interdependence is really, at its simplest form, I believe it's when we can rely and relate to each other. And that's massively important when you think about it from a relational and healing context, because there's so much you can do in your own relationship with yourself. You could do self-regulation of meditation, therapy, solitude, reflection, journaling, all of that. But the other half of that is co-regulation, which is that you have to be around other people who can trigger you, who can introduce emotionally corrective experience. So then your nervous system can rest and digest and expand to handle a wider range of different feelings and emotions. It helps you hold a space where you could unpack and unravel your feelings further. Yeah. So I believe to be in happiness, that feeling exists internally within ourselves, but it's also checked in relation to community and feeling understood in that sense of belonging, because there's so many studies that show that it's such an innate driver and a force of life that we are all desperately looking and seeking belonging, connection, and acceptance. It's our birthright to feel those things. And when we don't have it, it's like very detrimental emotionally and physically to our bodies.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's good to sort of set the scene for the conversation, because it's good to understand what it means in the first place. But I also feel like when I was, reading up on this topic in preparation for the conversation, I think there might be sort of two ends to it, right? Like social interdependence, it sounds like something that we definitely need. But at the same time, too much of it might not be that good. So I think there's kind of like this struggle for balance here, if we really look at it from that perspective, because it can impact our happiness overall. So how would you clarify that relationship? Because, it doesn't mean that, as long as you understand social interdependence and you kind of have that in your life, that, it's going to add to your happiness. Maybe it's going to take some of that away.
Yeah. It's just a vital part of being in community and being community with yourself and others. When you think about social interdependence and you break down that word, social means to be around people, and interdependence is like the balance between interdependence and then how you can be around other people. So I definitely agree that there's such a balance in that. I think relying on one or the other is, it might not always be the healthiest expression of that. I love that this conversation is so framed in like duality and imbalance.
Yeah.
It really is.
Yeah.
It's such a, like it's very yin and yang in that moment, because you can't always go to your community and you can't always do it alone. So there has to be this desire to seek and go between these two spaces.
Yeah. I think that's the toughest part, understanding the yin and yang of it, because we can go to the extreme of, same as happiness, the extreme of just everything needs to be good. Like, I just want to feel the good feelings, or, like I don't have happiness and everything I feel is bad. And, it's like this balance. And I think that's always tough. Now, talking about this topic, I think it's kind of relate to your work in a lot of ways, actually, when you sort of helped us to define the concept, because I think you write on a lot of different topics, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that includes mental health, identity, and holistic wellness, relationships as well. So understanding social interdependence would actually really help to kind of gain perspectives on these topics, and nurture that sense of compassion if anyone is struggling to understand the different perspectives in this space. So yeah, what's your thought on this?
Totally. And I love that question, because when I started writing about those topics, I actually thought about it from a really singular, self-contained point. I was like, I can do it on my own. We can do this on our own. We can heal on our own. Yeah. And throughout just talking to so many incredible experts and being checked by my editors and being like, we have to expand this, I realized that these topics are really enriched when we call in these other intersections that impact who we are. Yeah. And social interdependence really calls in this idea of unity and connection, that we are all kind of like a part of this journey together. And there's this really beautiful recognition that our actions impact other people. And it's this call to lean on like collective support when we need to. And I feel like for mental health and identity, social interdependence really acknowledges that our sense of self, they're shaped by these external influences regarding society, culture, family, community, and all of these systemic frameworks that impact how we grew up. Even you talking about Lunar New Year in your family, I'm Asian, I grew up in that kind of environment. I just immediately understood what you were talking about. We just have this like felt language for it. We don't have to say a lot, but there's this relation that happens when we're in these conversations. And I love understanding that there's all of these things that impact who we are. We're not just these closed containers like moving throughout life.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Especially in the multicultural context, it's even better to understand all the perspectives, because I think before I moved to Melbourne, I was, under the impression that, like my perspective is right. And, like you don't understand me. But then I think when I moved here, it really blew my mind when I started talking to people from different cultures, because each of them has their own perspective. And a lot of people are kind of, I would say, careful. And they tread really lightly when it comes to talking about these different topics and areas in life, because they have that cultural sensitivity. They have that lens of, oh, you know what, like I might hold this perspective, but it might not apply to you. And I would love to hear where you're coming from. And I think that's kind of, it helps because if we're talking about social interdependence in the multicultural context, you actually have to understand it, right? It's kind of like, it's a non-negotiable. You have to learn and adapt, because in this kind of a community, I feel like sometimes it's just challenging to navigate the simple conversations. Like I can recall instances where, you know, when I first moved here versus now, like thinking about conversations I used to have, or like things I used to just say randomly to friends that now that I think about, sounded really stupid and, you know, definitely did not help nurturing to nurture those relationships or to help with my overall happiness. But I didn't know that. And I think it helps to understand this from also, let's say, the perspective of going to the workplace, where you actually have a lot of social interdependence, and you know, you sort of spend a lot of your time at work. I think for yourself, it's probably not that corporate standard sort of like environment, but still you're going to interact with a lot of people. And I see that it seems like you've been in, you know, in various fields before you became a matchmaker / now writer. You did mention digital marketing, you know, that's what you were doing. And then I think you also did some recruitment in the technology space. So, you know, I'm sure this would help you to understand that perspective of social interdependence even better. So what would you say to be some of the few things that you gained from that time, you know, working in all these different industries before your journey now, that help us to understand, you know, your approach to these different perspectives?
Great question. And funnily enough, I took those other jobs because I felt like my role as a matchmaker was invalid enough. Like when I was, because I felt like my parents didn't understand it. When I said I was a matchmaker, they were like, "What do you mean you're helping people date?" I don't know. So that's an actual job. So throughout my 20s, I was toggling between this highly creative, seemingly made up job, and then being like, I'm going to actually do something that's related to my resume, that's going to build my career, that maybe can give me the sustainable life. And that's why I really believed in what I was talking about happiness earlier. I had to authentically be like, this is who I am as a person, and I'm choosing that completely. And I'm not going to be, I'm not going to waver from that and do things based on what other people believe, because this is what's best for me. So have had a pretty random resume. I worked for like a virtual reality nonprofit, like high-end matchmaking, tech recruiting for Series A, D companies. And social interdependence, interestingly enough, it's this kind of consistent through line to all of the jobs I've had. And it's really about this intentionality and this idea of building community and understanding and a shared vision. It wasn't just about, like, for recruiting and matchmaking, I think that's a very easy overlap. It's not just finding the right, perfect on paper person. It's thinking about it in context of this larger vision that they had. It's not, you know, finding a marketing manager that just has a perfect resume. It's who gets along with everybody at that company. Are we thinking about it in terms of personality fit? Are they going to rub people the wrong way? Just like with relationships, people want this certain match, but then are they the right person for their family? Do they have the right romantic vision? So social interdependence kind of blended to all of these different roles that I was navigating. When I think about it, I was like, oh my gosh, I had such a random career, but there have been some consistencies that I pulled in to kind of, you know, still have what I wanted during that time.
Yeah, definitely. And you know what? I find this to be probably the most interesting in the context of romantic relationships, because if you're going to be a matchmaker, you're going to have to understand people's background, a little bit like recruitment, you know. It's kind of like,
absolutely,
it's kind of like recruit this person for that person instead of an organization. So in that sense, it's kind of fun. And we've talked a little bit about, you know, social interdependence in the context of life in general, a little bit about work, and then it definitely manifests in romantic relationships too. And that's probably what our audience is here for, because that's in the title. So let's talk about it a bit more. I know I have a lot of questions for you, but I gotta go back to the topic because I think this is where it gets really interesting, especially when, again, when we're recording this episode, not only is it Lunar New Year, Valentine's Day is approaching, and a lot of people kind of like freak out when it comes to Valentine's Day because, you know, it's like this scary occasion. They could be single or like dating or actually be with a partner, and it's still like hard to navigate. And it's all put into this context of social interdependence in my mind because, you know, you're living in this community and you get affected by a lot of people, and then you know, interact with all these different sources of information. So how would you say, you know, especially from your perspective as a relationship coach, how would you say we can balance and navigate through this sphere of, you know, complexities when it comes to social interdependence and being in a relationship?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. And Valentine's Day is around the corner.
Yeah.
And it's funny, in a new year, if you don't have a partner, your parents could be like, what's going on? You know, like there's all of this really harmful messaging because romantic relationships, it's really on our own pace. And there's so much information coming from us, from social media and our friends and our communities and our family telling us who we need to be, the kind of relationship we need to have, the partner that we need to have. And it's helpful because they love and support who we are and who we want to be. But I really believe that there's specific moments to rely on that. And there's specific moments when you kind of like, that's when you kind of move towards your own internal interdependence with yourself and you really focus on what you need the best.
Yeah.
Relationships don't work if you're doing it for somebody else. If you're listening to what your friends tell you to do with your partner, it will almost always go wrong. I call that triangulation. Yeah. I don't even like it when my clients come to me and they talk to me about a problem they haven't talked about with their partner. I'm not their partner. I'm never going to be able to mind read what's happening, and I'm not going to have the answer. Yeah. Only their partner will. So I really believe that it's important to have these very direct conversations with the people in our lives and to understand who we really are so we can participate in these relationships and feel authentically expressed.
Yeah.
As soon as we start to, TikTok is wild. If you look at any kind of relationship topic, they will tell you 20 million different things to do. Yeah. And you can experiment and do all of these things, and it's not going to feel right for the relationship because you're not just dialing into who you are. So it's definitely a balancing act with those things.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's interesting though, because, you know, when it comes to relationship, this is what I find with myself. Like there are times when I notice, and from listening to my friends as well as noticing what I do myself, it really helps to focus on your own perspective. But at the same time, we need to get other perspectives because sometimes we can be in our own head. And I totally agree with you that having a conversation with your partner is way better than going to your relationship coach or your friends to ask for advice if you haven't even talked to that person. But it can be tricky. And that is because I've talked to a lot of friends and everyone is sort of on the same train that, you know, when it comes to talking with men in particular, in relationships is a little bit more challenging. And I could give you some examples of, you know, a friend talking about their partner not opening up, or a friend talking about a partner who just communicates in a very different style, or a friend talking about a partner that tells them one thing and, you know, does another. So there are a lot of things here, and it's kind of hard for them to have direct conversation with the person they're supposed to talk to. And so that's why we turn to other people in the community, in our own community, right, for that social interdependence, because I think it's so hard for us to navigate through all of this by ourselves. So how can we find that balance, you know, because sometimes it is actually hard to talk to that person that we are supposed to talk to. And this actually applies to not just romantic relationships, but I find in all relationships, we get perspectives first before we even talk to that particular person. How can we find that balance, and how can we not get influenced by, you know, our community so much that we forget about our own perspective and actually listening to the other person?
This is near and dear to me because I just experienced something like this very recently. Yeah, it was a moment when I just really needed help from my community. And I felt like my community, I love them so much. They're so incredible to me. But I felt like I wasn't getting the exact support I needed. And a lot of what I realized during my week was that there's this need to kind of create a container and set some of your own particular boundaries so you can really be vulnerable and express yourself fully. I think even with your friends and how you're describing that maybe your partner has a different communication style, it's going to your partner and inviting them into a moment and asking you to share space where it's, let's be vulnerable. I have this thing that I'm experiencing. Instead of being defensive, let's both kind of share these ideas, not have it mean anything about each other, but just have this really open dialogue about this thing that I'm feeling I'm not getting in the relationship. And I'm not blaming you. I just need this so I can be open with you and share things with you. When it's balanced like that with the partner, it's so much more full. And when you're talking to your friends, our friends, I think that's why therapists are so important. They're so skilled at holding space. There's something so beautiful about the way that they kind of remove themselves from the situations, and they understand you enough where they're able to set the right limits and perspective and mirroring for you. And a lot of our friends, they love us so deeply, but they want to protect us. They want to take care of us. They want to screw the person that's hurting us, and there's all of this getting in the way, and that can impact the way that they're holding space for us because they're kind of putting themselves in the dialogue as well. So with my friends, I actually tell them before I open up with them, I want to create a safe space because if you don't approach it with compassion on my side, I will shut down. Yeah. If you don't do that, I'm not going to like that. I'm actually not going to ask you for advice anymore. Yeah. I need this from you. And I'm very upfront about it with the people in my life. And from that point, I'm able to get the perspectives I'm looking for, but it's by being really clear and directive about exactly what I need. If not, then there's just a lot of stuff that can get mixed into that. And I don't love it. I don't want our therapist to be the only person that can hold space for us that way.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's why we have social interdependence in the first place, right? Because I think in this podcast, especially because we talk about happiness, a lot of the topics are about struggles that we have. And then a lot of the advice are kind of like, if you really need help, you're probably going to need to seek a therapist. And I think that's beautiful. Like we should open ourselves up for help. But at the same time, I think we shouldn't shut ourselves off from our community in the first place because, that's where we feel isolated. It's like we're isolating ourselves when we actually can reach out to others. And same thing as in relationship. And I think this is like probably the interesting thing in relationships. I don't know about other people, but I have this tendency to shut my partner off if I'm struggling with an issue that we're having and I try to address it, it didn't go anywhere. I would probably just stonewall them for a little bit because I need to distance myself from the situation. And I understand that this is not healthy behavior. So this is actually, and I also don't talk about it with friends. And I think it's kind of this really tough spot where, we're talking about that balance again. How do we regain that balance? Because I don't think not talking about it is healthy, but at the same time, I kind of don't want to just keep mulling over it because I want to get over it or I want to focus my energy on other things. At the same time, because I don't talk about it, I cannot focus on other things. So what would your advice be in that scenario?
I absolutely get that. And I love that you have such an awareness towards the stonewalling. That's really all it is, just noticing that and then making different decisions will completely change that behavior if you choose to do that. So in those moments, that's why social interdependence is so beautiful. But then there's also this need to kind of go internal and within. If I kind of use that as a moment to kind of center yourself, get into your body, understand why that happened, and then reach out when you feel appropriately regulated with the person. I've understood that I've done this thing. I could do this differently next time. Why is that driving me? What belief is inside of that? And that's not really interrogated with friends or your partner. You can share that with them, but when it's so core and it's so intrinsic, it does require a lot of internal reflection and dialogue and connecting with yourself really deeply.
Yeah.
So when you go to other people, they're not going to shake you. Your friends are not going to be like, oh, because, your partner's is a jerk or all of these things that take you away from you wanting to not do this behavior. And then your partner really feel that expression of, I went through a lot of reflection on this behavior. I don't want to do it again. If I do it again, these are probably things that trigger me. Yeah. Just to let you know, XYZ, that will probably cause me to move into that state because it's quite reactive. But as long as I'm working on it, you can call me out when appropriate. We can work on this together. So it's very synergistic. It's a relationship with the self. It's a relationship with the others and managing that with that level of skill requires a lot within yourself. You really need to know who you are.
Yeah, absolutely. I think knowing ourselves is definitely the first step in the whole process. Because if we don't know ourselves, then chances are we're going to get too socially interdependent. And that's also not good for, navigating through relationships, whether it be romantic or friendships. We want to have that sort of healthy ground of, interactions with everyone. And I think a lot of people are probably like myself, we struggle with this in the sense that sometimes we thought we knew ourselves and we actually don't know ourselves that well, and we're still slowly learning about ourselves so that we are, having the right kind of interaction, the right kind of mindset when it comes to being in a community, being with a partner. It's all a dynamic that is new to a lot of us, I guess. And I find this to be new in even social situations and social groups. You go to a new group and you're kind of like, oh, I'm reacting to this a little bit differently today. And, now I got to ground myself again. So that's definitely quite interesting to me to notice. But if we're talking about, romantic relationships in a bit more depth, when it comes to this topic, I think let's go into that space of asking ourselves questions, because we got to know ourselves and we got to ask ourselves questions. At the same time, we got to ask questions about our relationships too, right? To actually understand it. And through that lens of social interdependence, what do you think to be some of the thought-provoking questions we can keep in our minds so that, from time to time, we can perhaps visit those questions and check in with ourselves and with our relationships?
Yeah, there's no particular set of questions that's formulaic that you can apply to each person because it's so different.
Yeah.
I really believe that what makes social interdependence so beautiful is that there is this desire to understand somebody completely as much as you can, so you can interact with them in a way that they feel really validated and seen and heard. When you're able to do that, it adds this element of empathy, appreciation, kindness, gentleness. Oh, you do this because of that. I'm not going to blame you. I'm not going to mark you off. I'm not going to do these things because I get that now. Okay, I'm going to tread lightly. It's, these thought-provoking questions, I really believe that if you're just applying this lens of having true curiosity to see and experience people in the way that they deserve to be experienced, the way that they're hoping to be experienced, a particular framework is if somebody has a job, it's, well, why do you have the job you have? What job did you want when you were a kid? Are you aligned with your dreams right now? Why don't you have that job? What got in your way? Was it something about your parents? You just keep going down this rabbit hole and you keep pulling at the thread. And then before you know it, you're just completely up close with this person's core. You really understand why they're navigating their life the way that they are. And then there's a lot more appreciation for them and a lot more of this gentleness. And I really say gentleness because in social interdependence, there is this idea of community. And I believe that it's our jobs to hold the people that we love with a lot of tenderness. And it kind of happens when we understand them and we don't just force our perspective onto them because we think we know them.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to flip this a little bit as well because, on the one hand, we want to understand ourselves and understand others. And on the other hand, we also want to be seen and understood. So what should we do when, let's say we're in this, social context, or actually particularly for today's topic, in a romantic relationship or a partnership, and we feel like we're not getting asked any questions or the right questions so that we are actually understood?
Well, vulnerability begets vulnerability. So if you're not receiving it, it might be nice to model that, especially if you're the person that's noticing it, then you might have to be the one that paves the way. Sometimes it's frustrating if you're the person that's like, okay, I'm going to have to stand up and I'm going to have to be extremely uncomfortable and just tell you something that I'm experiencing.
Yeah.
But it definitely helps because when people feel that, it's such a visceral, charged feeling. When you're being really honest and open about yourself, it allows the other person to walk into that too. And then the deepening of that is really contingent on the reciprocal exchange that you're having together. Of you saying this thing, they say this thing, and then you just keep deepening and deepening. So yeah, when there's not a lot of vulnerability being expressed, maybe there's a risk of being seen or there's a risk of not wanting to say who you are. Yeah. And that kind of has to be eliminated if you really want to be there if the person like that. So one person has to take the first step, and hopefully the other person can step up and things can start happening romantically.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. In all relationships, right? Not just in romantic relationships. And I feel like the more you talked about it, the more I just kept thinking about like, that question somebody asked me a long time ago, like, how do you make friends as an adult? And I was like, oh, tough question, because that is actually also how a lot of romantic relationships begin as well, because you need to be a friend first before you can be a partner. I think that's really important, right? And it's kind of like the same thing. Like if you're not vulnerable, if you're not opening up and you're just shutting other people out, then that's not going to build any relationship. So, this is actually quite tough for some people to practice, especially for those that are used to just being on their own, or, like not that vulnerable or not that comfortable being vulnerable.
And it can happen very lightly because it feels so intense when you're just telling people who you are, and then you get a little bit of rejection. You're like, I'm closing off. I'm never going outside again. I'm never going to tell anyone who I really am.
Yeah.
But just when somebody can meet you on that level, it kind of wipes away all of those past interactions. And when you really do meet somebody that can interact with you on that level, it's just really profound.
Yeah.
So there's a risk of that for sure, but we can handle a little bit of uncomfortable, discomfort.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why we're having these conversations, because it's important to encourage people to open up and to be vulnerable. And that's why I love Brene Brown as well as a researcher, because she researches this topic and she talks so much about it. I'm like, that is true. And, it applies to all relationships. And, you're kind of confirming that too, from your work. It sounds like it's the same thing. So that's really good to hear. And I love that you said, there's no set of questions, because it depends on each person, depends on the context. And I think that's where our curiosity needs to kick in. We need to be curious enough about the person, the people, to be able to nurture those relationships. So by this point, I'm guessing our audience might still be a little bit sort of like, okay, Julie and Luke, that's good, but what do I do from here? So let's go into the practice section, where we can talk about something a bit more practical that everyone could try. So let's say now that everyone has understood social interdependence a little bit better, with different perspectives, what would be a practice that you recommend to them? Maybe this is something you do personally, and we can all try so that they can enhance their social interdependence while, sort of finding that balance with, maybe a romantic relationship, or maybe the relationship they have with themselves.
I was reflecting on this as we were talking, and holding space feels really important to keep harkening on, because the ability of you to hold space with your partner, for example, it shows the depth you can go to with your partner. If you're afraid to tell your partner certain things about your needs, your relationship can't move forward because you're holding yourself back in a pretty big way. So I really believe that there is such an ability for us to really set a container, enter a safe space, so we could really tell people who we are, what we need, and what we require in these relationships, so that we can move deeper into it. There's so many friendships that I've had in the past where I wouldn't be able to grow with them because it's like the relationship was frozen in like a certain period of time. It's like, oh, you're my high school friend. We can't talk like this.
Yeah.
And that is really disappointing, to feel this grief of, oh my gosh, we can only interact in this one way. The relationships I valued the most is I can grow and evolve, and the person doesn't assume I'm just the person I was 2 years ago. They evolve with me. They understand that I'm changing. I can tell them that I'm changing. We're not afraid to hurt each other's feelings because we can expand our relationship to include everything in it. And that happens from holding space. That happens from wanting to be with somebody and to invite them to be who they are, and for us not to judge them. And as I was saying before, it is a skill. It's something I'm still learning as a relationship coach. It's something I keep noticing I come back to a lot with relationship advice. All of it basically says talk to the person. But when you talk to the person, you can't put your stuff into it. You can't judge them. You can't blame them. You can't, do all of these things. You have to understand them and then negotiate any compromises or differences that you have together if you want to make the relationship work. So yeah, I would say that feels pretty important to me, that practice of when you enter situations with your friends, when they're asking for advice, maybe kind of slow down, be in your body a little bit and think about how can I really be there for the person and not put my stuff into it. I don't have an agenda. I'm not trying to shape the conversation. I just want my friend to feel completely heard. And it's so simple.
Yeah.
But I just don't think a lot of people are doing it. And I do believe that's why there's all of this information out there. It's like telling you what to do versus what if someone just really understands you and they just sit with you and you don't feel misunderstood? Would that change something in how you're with your friends and your family and your partner?
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. And I remember, I think a while ago, there was a practice that was recommended on this show about also about holding space. And it was quite specific. I think it was something like, put a timer on for, let's say, 5 minutes and let the other person tell you whatever they want to tell you. And this is actually quite funny. So I was actually dating someone at the time of that practice. And I tried that practice with that person. And that person went, I don't have anything to tell you. That's it. And I was like, in my mind, I was kind of thinking, okay, I'm trying to hold space, but this person doesn't say anything. Or they don't have anything to say at that particular moment, which is interesting. Now, if that happens, and this is a relationship that you really want to work on, what should we do in that scenario? Because we do want to hold space, but not a lot of people are comfortable with the space being held for them, for example.
Right. I mean, I think a lot about relationship check-ins. When there's a relationship check-in, there's a little bit of a structure to it where it's, let's have this time together, 30 minutes, an hour, and here's a list of questions I prepared. Maybe you can prepare one as well, and we can just talk about things that have come up throughout a relationship. That kind of becomes a guide so that at least the questions fill the space and then the conversation flows from all of these things that you've noticed. In those moments, it might be really good to kind of add this level of interrogation to it and it's not in this terribly intense way. It's just, we're going to unpack this specific thing. Maybe you don't have anything you want to talk about in all of this, expansion, but what about this moment that happened in a relationship last month? I noticed you're kind of upset about it. Do you want to share anything with me? And it's no judgment, because that's what a relationship check-in is. You can't get mad at them in that moment. You're like totally needing to hear them out. So then they can feel like they can say that thing and then you can kind of respond to that. So I recommend some kind of structuring towards that. And that also feels really nice when your partner is not doing it in an intense way, but they're doing it in terms of they're noticing something about you. They want to know how they can make the relationship better. It just adds a lot of sweetness to it, because we all want to be understood. We all want to know that when something's happened, someone noticed that and they can pick up on it and they can bring it back and try to rectify it somehow.
Yeah, absolutely. I really love that. And, I think this is something that we definitely all need to learn to do and practice doing them. And the more we do them, the more it's going to be easier for us to actually, get through the process. And thank you for sharing all your insights today, and especially that practice. I really love it. Now, it's time for us to wrap up. And in wrapping up, we have open mic, and we would love to invite you to talk about anything you're passionate about that you haven't got the chance to share earlier in the conversation. So go for it, Julie.
Yeah, I mean, I'm passionate about so many things, but I would say right now I'm very passionate about working with the clients I have. It's really amazing because I do a lot of different personality assessment. I do matchmaking. I do online dating, swiping, and it's really, really incredible to work with people that not only want to get into relationships, but they want to get into relationships that are really thoughtful and conscious, and they want to meet people where they're at. So I'm really passionate about that. I think I just take a lot of time personally to do a lot of my own solitude, which is a new theme for my Lunar New Year. That was one of the things I wanted to step into. I just really want to take this time to develop a really deep relationship with myself. And I preach it all the time in my relationship consulting. I'm just always like, the important the most important relationship you have in your life is yourself. But it's even something I struggle to practice with because a lot of my life is so informed by my partner, my community, and my family. So for me to not only know that and to teach it, but to really embody it in a very specific way, those are two things that I'm definitely taking a lot of time to do.
Yeah, well, beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that and for coming on with us today. If our audience would like to find out more about your work, where should they go?
They should go to my website, julienguyen.love. Nguyen is how you spell that win part of my website. And that's pretty much it. I don't use social media, so it's pretty much my website and all of the writings I have. I have a column on Very Well Mind where I just do a lot of insights about matchmaking, love, relationships that I do every single month. You can catch me on there.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. And thanks again for joining us.
Oh my gosh, it was such a pleasure.
You have been listening to Sero Boost, the Happiness Science Insights podcast produced by the Happiness Science Labs, a division of LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes are available from 10 life management perspectives and can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, and other podcasting apps available on your devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, share, and subscribe to our channel so that other people can find it and we can continue to provide quality content. More of our work can be found on our website, ha.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Lu Ngo. Thanks for tuning in.